but I do still remember certain things about politics because I read it most of the year round. Many people, politics is one of those arguments that people will either really like to run in it or just hate it, and especially a lot of judges will hate seeing it. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, it comes up all the time because one of the very few constants among topics that you'll see in a debate tournament is that they use the federal government. And politics debates are really debates about the reactions of primarily individuals who are currently in the federal government. So understanding that, I mean, if the debate is going to revolve around the federal government, you can usually anticipate that your disad will be able to link some, which is very useful. The other reason that people hate politics is that people lie a lot when they do politics. Parley is in a weird situation where we're doing a very kind of policy-centric form of debate without evidence. And without evidence, it's very easy to lie about the status quo, to just make things up. And people do it less or more, and the things I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to tell you to lie, but I am going to tell you when you're crafting your unique disorders that you want to shape the world to facilitate the way your disad is working. So I think there's a clear distinction there between just making things up and actually pulling facts out of the world and being somewhat selectively omitting those facts that aren't as useful to you. But people still lie about it. That said, I think it's really important. First off, if you actually there are good politics debater, it's a very, very useful tool in your skill set. It's the way that you always have a disad, even on a topic that you're just not really very familiar with. And it consistently comes up. And moreover, people want to read it against you. And honestly, I sort of see politics kind of as the corrective to the loss of stock issue solvency. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. But back in the day, somebody would read an affirmative and be like, oh, that won't work. That's a silly idea. Here's like 10 reasons why your plan doesn't solve what you want it to solve. And in the old days, people were like, yeah, you've won because you've demonstrated that the affirmative hasn't solved their harms, and so that's the end of the debate. In the modern world, that's insufficient. You can't just rely on solvency defense to win a debate when framework is net benefits. You need offense. And so politics ends up becoming that generic offense, that generic reason to reject a plan that doesn't really work. Because what is politics about? It's about the symbolic effect of the plan, the political effect of the plan. If you're the negative, and you can prove that the plan is going to not work and have bad symbolic effects, then you won't do it. But conversely, if you're the affirmative, and you can demonstrate that, yeah, maybe our plan doesn't work, but we'll have these symbolic effects that are probably going to be mildly positive, then we'd probably do it anyway. Like the government does all sorts of stupid things for political and symbolic reasons all the time. So I think it's actually a pretty realistic depiction of the world. Also, I mean, ultimately, politics is about people. And that makes it very similar to every disad. Like when we're talking about an economics disad or a relations disad or anything really except a big environmental disad, what we're talking, the argument is that the plan will lead human beings to do certain things in response to it. And that's really, I mean, those debates are good because human beings are pretty accessible. Like one of the few things that we all share in common is sort of human nature. I'm not really a believer in social construction of human nature. I think human nature is a thing. And it's why we all have this common grammar and common source of evidence to debate about. Like when we talk about foreign leaders behaving in certain ways in response to being provoked, we're appealing to our broad understanding of human nature. And that applies just as much to the politics debate, because you're talking about how individual legislators, how voters, or how somebody else will react. So I think it's important to understand politics just on a pragmatic basis, because you will hear it, and you will have situations where you would really like to have a disad to read. It's valuable. And I think it's not nearly as bad for debate if people make it out, so we want people to stop lying. But before we do that, I want to talk about disads broadly, because it's sort of, politics is generally run in the form of a disad. And if you don't have a full understanding of what's going on with the disad, then telling you about all these political things is really important. So, standard template. This is the standard template for a disad. You've almost certainly seen it. The uniqueness debate is the debate about the status quo. And it's not a debate where you want to just block random facts about the status quo. You're trying to paint a picture of the status quo that serves your interests. So, you're the negative. which you will be when you read a politics dissent. You want to paint a picture of the status quo that is both awesome and fragile, right? Awesome and fragile. If the status quo is awesome, then we don't need to do anything. Things are just happy and great. Funny times, roaming and cash. But if it's not fragile, then maybe the affirmative plan won't really change anything about the world that will hurt it. So the idea is, think about it. If the world writ large were like a Ming vase perched on a very thin pedestal, and somebody was like, we should run around the room. You're like, that's a terrible idea. There's a Ming vase on a very thin pedestal. It's going to fall if you do anything, right? The idea is that when you're in the negative, if you paint a picture of the world that is doing well but fragile, it's very hard to justify acting broadly. And so if you win that argument, you're in good shape. And the thing about uniqueness is, that's kind of the top level debate. But uniqueness applies to every level of the dissent, right? You're always talking about what the status quo is. And novice debaters have the most trouble with it because it's not intuitive, right? We think when we talk about policy in our daily lives outside of the world of debate, we usually are really good at talking about what the plan will do, what certain policies would impact. I mean, even you have political discussions with your parents. They'll be like, well, if we passed Obamacare, this would happen. It would be terrible, right? They're able to handle link-through impact debate. That's something everybody kind of has an intuitive grasp of. Uniqueness is not something we have an intuitive grasp of because we think about the world as though it's a constant, as though it's something that's out there and something that's not up for debate. But in the debate round, uniqueness is up for debate. What the world is for the purposes of your dissad is certainly up for debate. And in that sense, I don't know how many of you have seen Inception. Yeah, a lot of you. So I like to think about it, when you're crafting a uniqueness story, you're sort of like an architect in Inception. You're trying to craft a world that, that's very similar to the real world, that selectively omits certain facts about it that are not useful to you. And that shapes the way that the arguments will play out in the rest of the dissent. And link through impact. Misunderstanding. So that's dissent. So how about politics? So politics dissads usually kind of have three basic categories, if you will, the type of the subject matter of the dissad. You have legislative politics, you have elections, which we're going to talk about a lot because that's going to be the big dissad of the fall. And then we'll call it other, relations. Sometimes there's a weird hybrid, if you were in the demo debate yesterday, you saw this sort of interesting dissad where the negative was arguing that the plan would change the results of the elections, which would somehow control whether raw negotiations were successful. I have issues with that argument. We'll talk about. But so basically, this is what you'll see. Most politics dissads are usually legislative. The story will sound something like this: either in the status quo, this amazing bill is going to pass. It's really awesome. We'll save the world. But it's on a knife edge. It's really close. Notice the structure of that argument, right? If we're talking about uniqueness as awesomeness and fragility, right? You're saying it's awesome. This good bill is going to pass. It's fragile. The vote's close. And understanding that balance is very good. And then you'll say something like, if we pass the plan, people will get angry. Probably Republicans will get angry, and they will become irrational and not vote for it. It's common. And there's a variety of different link arguments. And then, you go, and then internal link impacts. Without the plan, a variety of things don't happen, and destroys the world. In elections, dissad is actually also somewhat intuitive. So if we're in an elections world, the awesomeness argument is, hey, the right team is going to win the election if nothing happens right now. But the fragile thing is, but the election's really close. And so it could go either way, or it's fragile. And then the argument is that passing the policy will change the way people vote, that they will react negatively to it, or that somebody's base will not come out. All of those arguments come out. This is the basic structure. And again, you can see, this is why this argument comes up over and over again. There's always a bill in Congress that somebody can find, except when you're running for an election, in which case you have access to the election system. So that's probably good. One of the key things one of the areas of politics that's sort of unique and that doesn't really come up in a lot of dissent, but does come up a lot in politics, is issues with the links playing with our understanding of fiat. So let's talk about the different types of links people argue. So, I'm going to be very simple and divide them into good and bad, because I believe in binary. So, good links are about people's reactions, and we'll talk about that. And bad links are about the mechanics of getting the plan passed. So, why? So what is fiat, right? The whole point of fiat is to imagine a world in which your hypothetical plan is passed. And the idea is that we don't have to worry about would the plan actually pass in the real world. We get past that, and we actually debate about the impacts of the plan. That notion of fiat, which I feel is pretty common, is sort of ignored when people think arguments about the passage of plans. So the classic example is probably horse trading. The logic of a horse trading argument is that in the process of trying to get a bill through Congress, one of the legislators will have to make some sort of trade with other legislators so that they'll agree to get the plan passed. For example, you got a situation where Republicans are in the House and they don't want to pass a bill, and the Senate Democrats they can't agree. So maybe the argument would be that in a world where your plan passed, well, that would only make sense in a world where the Republicans changed their mind. So somehow in the process of that, there would have had to have been a trade. Like the Republicans in the House would have only agreed to enact your plan if they had gotten a concession from the Democrats. So as a result of that, this other terrible bill will pass, and that leads to the impacts. The problem with that argument is that it ignores fiat, right? Fiat gets past negotiations. Fiat gets past all the mechanics and the sausage making of enacting the plan. So in a world where you're saying, if we do the plan will have required horse trading that's incoherent. The whole fiat checks the link is the classic way to say this argument. Fiat means that we assume that they just voted for it. That there were they didn't negotiate, that they didn't trade off with particular bills, they just voted for it. And so this links of this nature that talk about the sausage that would have been made had the bill been passed are troubling. Not to say there are no theoretical arguments that justify it, there are some, but I feel like generally these are the weaker links, and you should be trying to argue that they're checked back. The better links are about how people react to certain things, right? When you're reading a dissad and you say, this was really especially true back when Democrats had a clean majority in both the House and Senate. But if you would say that certain senators or certain House members would be very upset if the bill passed, and therefore would lash out afterwards, that's a legitimate link, because what you're talking about is the plan has happened. Now, how do people feel about it? What are people going to do as a result of it? And so things like that are really good. One particular link I want to talk about that's also sort of strange is political capital. This is a very common argument, probably as a result of the fact that very stupid journalists say it over and over and over again. And as a result, policy has adopted it. Well, not really adopted it, but there's a whole bunch of parts that say political capital is a thing, and that certain plans cost political capital. It's rooted in people who just really journalists are awful. So they say really stupid things about politics. It's like might as well be using TMZ for our evidence. Anyway, so the notion of political capital briefly is the idea that either the president or certain people in Congress have a certain amount of influence, and if they use their influence on a particular bill, they will not have more influence to use in the future. And they use the metaphor of capital as though it's like an account you have as a bank to get your bill passed, and it somehow declines in value. You somehow run out of political capital in some way. I think that you'll hear that link, and you should be problematizing it. Like the counter link is an argument that's just like winners win, right? If we get a bill passed, then people will see us as winners, and they'll join the lead horse. I mean, this is equally compelling an argument. There's no bank of political capital that actually exists. So whenever you hear that phrase as an MG listening to a politics essay, you should be thinking, this is weak. I should think about a link turn. It's there. And if you're tempted to make a political capital argument, you should be framing it in terms of, like, again, go back to real people. Like, one of the things that really good debaters consistently do is they abstract concepts and they bring them back to, like, what that means in terms of, like, individual behavior and individual interaction, right? So what does political capital actually mean when it's talking about, like, politicos negotiating with one another? Well, it's one politico telling another, like, I'm tired of doing all this shit for you. You need to let me, you need to let it go, or I did this thing and nothing, I didn't get anything good out of it. So if you frame it in terms of, like, the Republicans will be tired of Obama after the plan or something like that, then you actually have an argument that makes some sense. But if you're just saying political capital, you're repeating the So that's the core about the link debate in politics. Internal link debate is like any other, it depends on the bill you're talking about. It's sort of, in some sense, like politics ends up being a debate within the debate. It's like you have the top level debate about the bill itself, or about the mechanics of passing the bill, and then you have the underlying debate, which is like its own unique policy debate about the content of that particular bill. You'll notice that a lot. Like we had 2009 was a big year for healthcare politics because that was when Obamacare, the people were fighting about whether that was going to be passed. And so many debates would have a top-level debate about whether Obamacare would pass or not, and then a lower-level debate about whether that was good or not. So strategic considerations on impact. So one of the reasons politics can be really effective, especially in a world where we're talking about legislation, is that politics ends up usually can often get a bill that will have a substantial impact on the economy. And as such, it's sort of a really good way to get a backdoor economics dissent. My partner and I were reputed to be very good at the economy debate. We didn't really read economics dissents. We read politics dissents to get access to the economics debate. The idea was that you would win that you didn't pass healthcare reform. Healthcare reform was, going to affect 1/6 of the economy and have a map out of the way the world worked. And so when we were arguing that your plan would lead to economic collapse, it's a lot more persuasive to say your plan will lead to economic collapse because it will derail healthcare reform, as opposed to your plan will lead to economic collapse because you spend $50 million. Right? Spending $50 million is trivial in a multi-trillion-dollar budget. So using politics, if you really want to talk about the economy, oftentimes you want to say a politics dissent. So let's talk about two other things. What happens? So this is more talk about the basic mechanics of politics. Now we're talking about why you lose the argument. I assume some of you come to this room because you're really tired of losing this argument and wondering why it keeps happening. Reason number one, you're losing the counterpoint. So politics in the modern world, especially in the world where people are moving away from traditionality, seems always usually joined with a agent counterpoint. We'll talk a little more about this in my next lecture about the courts, but the idea is that you'll read a politics dissent that says, if we do the plan, then Congress will not pass this bill because legislators will be angry at each other, etc. And then you'll read a counterplan that says the Supreme Court will do the affirmative. It solves the affirmative because the court has passed, and it avoids the disadvantage because legislators aren't going to be angry at the Supreme Court for making a holding about constitutional law. That's a really, really common strategy. If you don't have, and in that world, they've captured the entirety of your affirmative. So if you're just reading defensive, you're just being like, oh, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true. The dissad you're going to lose because any risk of the dissad is going to outweigh your non-existent affirmative.
Good question.
Yes.
Did you say that the reason people lose their arguments because they lose the dissad and they lose the counterpoint?
Well, I mean, it's sort of, I guess I should rephrase. They lose the dissad, and they don't, the counterpoint is capturing the case. So they let the counterpoint capture the case and then read defense against the disadvantage. That's a very common reason people lose debates about politics. And you can feel really frustrated when you do that because you've made a bunch of really good intuitive arguments about why the politics dissent is stupid, and the politics dissent probably is stupid, and yet you've lost to it. That happens a lot. That's a problem with your overarching strategy at that point. Like you need to be figuring out reasons why the counterplan doesn't solve and figuring out reasons why the counterplan is a bad idea. If you want to learn more about how to deal with quartz counterplanes, I'll talk about that later. But that's really common.
Can I make a quick point here?
Sure.
So, what usually ends up happening with these debates, just having judged a bunch of them, is sometimes somebody will just concede that the counterplan solves the case, and then even if politics is that is done, they'll still lose because there's a small risk in politics. Often, what ends up happening is that there will be the counterplan will solve most of the case, and there will be some risk of the politics is that. And usually, the framing question that you always have to keep in mind on both sides is just, is the marginal solvency deficit of the counterplan versus the affirmative bigger than the risk of the impact of politics? And that's the framing question both ways. So if you keep that in mind, I think that makes your PMR and LR equations way, way clearer. So
that's absolutely true. I mean, there's a lot of counterplans that don't capture all the actions. That's precisely right. The second big reason that a lot of intermediate debaters lose politics is that they read link terms without uniqueness. That happens all the time. So let's say I'm going to use we're going to start using midterms to this at this point. So remember, the argument, if you were at the Dem debate yesterday, was that the Democrats are going to win the midterms elections now, which is sort of weird to say. I'll explain why. And the link is that this will make, the link is that the plan will somehow motivate the Republican base, I think. I don't remember the exact details of the dissent. And that somehow this will lead to Iran negotiations going well. And that will prevent Israel from strike.
It's a joke.
So maybe I'm not doing it justice, but I think I'm pretty close. So I don't think I'm being unfair. So a common strategy, right? If you remember, if you had a dissat lecture, you know that dissats, you usually want to turn them if you can. You have two options, right? You can link turn dissat, or you can impact turn. A link turn in this debate would sound something like, no, actually, the plan makes Republicans less likely to vote, or actually makes Republicans less likely, or turn, Democrats will be motivated by the plan, so they'll turn out in greater numbers. And so it's more likely that the Democrats will win the election. The problem is you conceded this argument above it that says the Dems are going to win the election now. So think about the logic of what you're saying. If you're saying, basically your thesis as the affirmative after responding to this ad is the Democrats are going to win the midterms election now, but our app makes the Democrats more likely to win the election. And that's good. See the problem? There's no impact to that argument. You haven't won the meetings. You've lost the debate about the status quo. You've lost the debate that the status quo is awesome with respect to this app. And then you're trying to make arguments about how your plan somehow improves what is effectively an unimprovable status quo in this context. So this is a really common mistake, and it happens in bills all the time. Say, you'll have a uniqueness argument about this bill is going to pass now, and the link is that somehow the plan is going to derail it. And then, the intermediate debate will start on the link debate, and they'll be like, no, the plan actually makes people like the bill even more. And that's offense. We get a link turn. No, you don't get a link turn until you read uniqueness for your argument to establish that. At a minimum, you don't have to win the argument that it's the other way. Like, you don't have to win the argument that actually Republicans will win. What you have to win is that the future is uncertain. You need to win that there is some ambiguity about what will happen, because then in that world, if your plan increases the probability of the positive outcome, that suddenly means that you have offense on the That's really how else do you lose when you're why do you lose politics? You're blippy. That happens all the time. One of the things that so politics is that you'll notice that people are really blippy on politics all the time. They're just like, Republicans are going to vote this way because. And so you think to yourself, wow, there's all these claims on the diss ad. It's really, really, it's crazy. The way I need to respond to this is by just being equally blippy and going down wrong. Like, remember that I'm big on telling stories and not so big on blippy line by line. So the idea is that, what is the fundamental uniqueness argument or link argument I need to win? and then give a core thesis about why you're winning that argument with nuanced and detailed warrants. That's the one that gets you out of it. And elections is going to be a classic example of that. Like, I think one of the things that is going to happen on these elections debates is that a lot of teams are going to run uniqueness stories, maybe about the Democrats winning now, and they're going to throw out a couple of polls. You need to be like, your temptation might be to be flippant and just kind of, or very, very flippy about it. You shouldn't be. Another reason people lose to this argument is they condemn it without understanding it. They're like, politics is stupid. It's just, or they read a K of politics. This is not a wise decision. First off, like, what you're doing is you're basically reading a K of a disad. And Ks inevitably take a lot of time to put out. So even if you're right, let's just assume in a world where you're right about your K of politics. I think them kicking the disad, not going for it anymore, probably resolves your criticism, probably. Moreover, it's the nuanced thing is not to say politics is bad. You can make nuanced arguments about specific link arguments being illegitimate. That's a better argument. But if you condemn politics, it's usually like, the savvy politics debater is just going to get up and say, look, this is just a disad about how people are going to react to your plan. And you can just be like, it's just a bad category of argument you shouldn't think about. It's just not persuasive. And usually that's what happens. Usually you just attempt to completely exclude certain arguments. The final reason that the one you need to be kind of worried about is what is your opponent lying. And this is sort of like there's not really a good thing to do about this because partly we don't have evidence. It's hard to call people lying. And a lot of these debates, especially when we're talking about the status quo, that's a fact debate, right? It's funny how we criticize fact debate constantly. Like, you can't evaluate a fact debate. You don't have evidence. You can't do it. That's why we only have policy resolutions. Except that fact debates kind of keep sneaking back in unless the debates you want to have. So, you have to. One of the things when you're confronted with a situation where you've got two competing fact claims and they're not resolvable and it's on a very important issue, is you try and find the way to win the debate on another area, like going through impact terms. Usually that's wise, especially if you're going to. Combined with that, I guess we should talk about general strategies when you're listening to a politics disad. So when you're an MG, what are you listening for? So usually the MG's got here's the politics disad for the first time. The MG's the person who has to figure out how to respond to it. So what is your mental model for responding to a politics disad? So the one I use is pretty straightforward. It's listening to the quality of the uniqueness argument. Is usually the basis for figuring out general strategy. If the uniqueness argument at the top level is very good, I'm probably not going to go for link terms because of the dynamic we just talked about. If you read a link term without a uniqueness argument, you're in all sorts of trouble. So when I hear really good uniqueness arguments, if I've been reading about the world and I think what they're saying is right, then I'm not going to try and link term to this out. I'm going to look for another place. For example, or if I just don't want to deal with uniqueness. What I'm waiting for is an argument that doesn't have uniqueness. I'm listening for it, and then I'm thinking, how do I win that? So, for example, the last night I said, right? Democrats are going to win the midterms now. Plan makes the Republican base come out to vote, so the Republicans win the midterms, and that's going to lead to Iran negotiations. So, there's two things to notice about this jump, which I think might have been one you noticed before. The first is, obviously, it's not clear why on earth the Republicans winning the midterms would have any impact on the negotiations between the United States State Department, which will still be staffed by Democrats, and Iran. But the second thing, and probably the more important thing in the context of this particular discussion, is that there's no uniqueness for this argument when they read it in that debate. They said Iran negotiations are going to be successful, or are going to fail. But they didn't really have good warrants for the arguments why Iran negotiations were going to be successful in the status quo. So when I heard this disad, that was the first place I was like, ooh, we're going to have fun, staking most of our arguments right here. Pinpointing the uniqueness, reading arguments about we're going to have failure in the status quo of these negotiations because people think Obama is weak after Hamas and Iran is like us, all blah, and then you're going to read turns that say, actually, if the Republicans win, Obama will have a very compelling story to say, like, look, I mean, you got crazy people might be here in 2016, so you better negotiate with us or it's not going to get any better for you. So if you win that argument that actually, if you control this internally, if you win the uniqueness argument that Iran negotiations are going to fail now and that the Republican election is going to lead to them being more likely to succeed, then you straight turn to dissent. You can also do that on the impact level. I mean, you could make a compelling argument that Israel first strike was good. I don't think it's nearly. I used to think that was really unpersuasive. I don't anymore. I think that's a much closer argument than people seem to think. Israel, if you believe that the world of negotiations is a world where Iran gets nuclear weapons and a world where Israel first strike is a world where Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons, you could make a pretty compelling argument that Israel first strike is good. But in any event, what I'm trying to communicate is that you use the uniqueness arguments as your catalyst for when you're listening to a dissent of how you think about your to respond to it. All right, so that's enough about politics generally. Let's talk about the midterms dissent. This will come up a lot. So first, what are the midterms? So, while we elect the president every 4 years, we elect Congress every 2. The whole House is up for election, and 33 or 34 seats are up in the Senate. And that's mostly it. There might be some state-level governor elections too, but the odds of those being the meat of the politics of this are low because the impact of governors winning is pretty trivial generally. Yes.
Well, why are all the seats in the House up but only a certain amount of the Senate?
So the House members have 2-year terms and Senate members have 6-year terms. And so if we have elections every 2 years, not every senator will be up. They rotate. 33 seats are up every 2 years. So basically, the first thing to remember is the only thing that the midterms will really be controlling over is the composition of Congress. And it's important to think, remember we thought there were 3 branches of government. You probably heard in your 3rd grade civics class: Congress, executive, and judicial. So you're like, oh, those are equal, right? So it's really important that Congress be there. And then you actually think about the total number of government employees. If you think about it, the congressional branch might have this many. It's Congress. And the executive branch will have this many. Judicial branch will have this many. Every agency, the State Department, the Defense Department, the EPA, every agency that implements actions, all those people are employed by the executive branch, not be up for election, or even have anybody above them who's up for election in the midterms. So if the fundamental problem with this ad, if there is one, was that because Republicans win, that would change Iran negotiations. Obama's going to be president until 2016. His State Department is going to be handling negotiations until 2016, maybe early 2017. So, really, if people are reading a midterms dissent against you and they're claiming the impact is like a foreign relations issue or a presidential executive authority issue, you should obviously be reading an open argument. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. So, what does Congress do? It generally passes bills. But you need both houses of Congress to agree to pass the same bill. And that can be pretty challenging. And so, in past elections, Congress, the congressional allocations have been pretty important because, the House and Senate open play. Here's the problem. In this year's election, the GOP is going to win the House. For sure. And that's not a fragile outcome. If you go to Real Clear Politics or any of the political sites, GOP is going to keep the House. They've got about 225, 230 seats pretty much locked down. And that's not because they're a majority, it's because of the way that congressional districts are lined up. So they're going to win. And I want you to realize that GOP is going to win the House in the midterm elections, and the president's going to be in power, and he's Democrat. Which means that the odds that the results of the midterm elections will have, will actually implicate the passage of any particular bill are really, 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 really low, right? Because basically the House does not, very little is passing, period. The stuff that's passing has massive bipartisan support. Those are very few bills. So the stories most people are going to want to tell about the midterm elections, they're going to say like, whatever, Democrats are going to win now, you're going to make the Republicans win, that's going to derail this legislation. That makes no sense at all. They're not going to be able to win that uniqueness argument about Democrats winning the House, and as a result, and they're not going to be able to win arguments that these bills, any sort of partisan or difficult bill is going to pass through Congress in the next 2 years. It's just not. We're going to get a pretty good demo on it. But what is close, actually, is the Senate. The Senate's on a knife edge. I checked, when I was checking real quick politics, it looks like there are about 14, the Senate has 100 seats, because every state has 2 senators, there are 50 states. Sure. 47 senators are leaning Republican, or seats, and 46 are leaning Dem. And then there are like 9, or maybe it was 46, 45, and there are about 9 that were particularly up for grabs. So this election is really close. The Senate, it's primarily because it's a bad map for Democrats in the sense that, it's 6 years after 2008 when Obama swept in and had a huge wave in the Senate. So you have a whole bunch of people in states like Alaska and Arkansas and traditional red states that are Democrats trying to run in very unfavorable political environments. So it's like, even though right now it's actually something like, in this term it's like 55-45, there's a really good shot of a big swing to the Republicans. And I would be surprised if the Republicans didn't get at least 49. So we have this thing that's actually pretty close that would sort of be the good vehicle for a politics attack, in the sense that we probably will be able to make an okay awesomeness argument that the Democrats will win, and we have a compelling argument that it's actually kind of fragile, that the situation could change, that a mild change in the way that people view, in a couple of elections will be enough to swing the balance. That's a good situation for a unique story for a dissent. So what can we actually do with that? And I'm stumped to think of, there's not really a lot, but the big area that I think maybe is judges. People are familiar with the bomb, what do you call that one where you set off the nuclear arm? So the Senate has a rule we call the filibuster rule that says that you need 60 votes to pass them. But over the last 20 years or so, various minorities of senators have used that to thwart the appointment of federal judges to the ire of the party that is then in the majority. And this sort of reverses, like in the 90s, the Republicans had the Senate and were trying to appoint a bunch of their favorite people to like the DC circuit and the various appellate courts. And Democrats were like, we really don't want that to happen. Especially with a few of these people who look really like they'd be very conservative and very hard to fight Supreme Court justices. Republicans were really pissed about that. And then the Democrats took the Senate, and it's all of a sudden they're like, we want to be able to appoint judges with a simple majority. And the Republicans were like, well, we don't want your guys to be judges any more than you didn't want our guys to be judges. And so basically there were big fights over judicial appointments. And finally, Harry Reid got tired of it, especially with regard to the DC circuit, and he basically made a new Senate rule that was like, guess what, for judicial appointments and for, staff appointments, like Secretary of State, stuff like that, you only need 50 votes. And so the Democrats were able to immediately then be like, well, look at it, we actually have 55 votes, so we're going to appoint all the judges to the vote. That rule is not in place for the Supreme Court. So, but that's the status quo, and it's sort of, the problem is that distinction between the Supreme Court and the appellate courts probably can't hold, right? Like, Republicans are furious about it, obviously, because there's been this long tradition of respecting the filibuster. They had the opportunity to get rid of the filibuster and appoint the judges they want about 10 years ago. They didn't do it, assuming that this truce would hold, and it didn't. Effectively, they feel like the Democrats cut them off. So, basically, probably that 50 vote threshold is going to be real for all judges, including Supreme Court judges. That would be, I think that's fair. So the disad, it's rough because the disad is almost inherently going to be speculative, but this is all that senators really have their own control over, because the key thing to remember is while both houses have to pass legislation, the Senate appoints judge has to advise and consent on judges. The House has no part in it. So Republican control of the House doesn't matter for judicial appointments. So if a big judicial appointment comes up, like for example a Supreme Court appointment, because one of our 70-plus-year-old judges dies, that whether or not the Democrats have control of the Senate, have 50 votes in the Senate, is going to be important as to the kind of judge they're going to nominate, as to whether Republicans are going to force on the president. So, that's basically where I think there could be a dissonance. It's annoying because it has to be so speculative by nature, right? Like you have no idea. Yes.
Not only on the note of the judges, I mean, I've seen the judges scenario kind of tossed around, especially when a lot of the Tea Party challengers were arising. But I mean, obviously, looking at a lot of the results from the primary elections, the Tea Party scenario is kind of non-unique. Do you think that not only is the judges scenario going to impact, but is there a possibility of like an impeachment impact because of the talks that are going on?
No, Republicans are not going to impeach Obama.
Yeah.
That funny thing is there was a pretty good article that was like, that's on MSNBC constantly, but the Republicans are not influenced as much as especially the people who are running for Republicans. Like John Boehner is no fool.
Right.
Neither is Mitch McConnell. The other guys are professionals. And there are like Sarah Palin said something about impeachment.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. It would be strategically very unwise. Right. It historically it made the Republicans very unpopular when they were trying to impeach Clinton.
Yeah.
Especially with 2 years left, there's really not a good reason to do that. The idea is that why would they jeopardize their chances of getting there? So, I mean, you could go for an argument that Republicans will vote to impeach or something in the House, but that would require you, and also remember, that would require you, the first impeachment proceeding happens in the House chamber. The election's not going to change whether Republicans have control of the House or not. Maybe it changes the dynamics of the House, of the Republican constituencies, in the sense that there's more Tea Party members, so they do something silly. But there's no way there would be 235 Tea Party members.
Right.
There's a lot of establishment Republicans. They're really not a fan of the idea of impeaching Obama for good reason. It would be very, very bad if they're So, that is one angle, though, to take to try and argue about the impact of the election on particular constituencies within Congress. Like, there used to be the Blue Dog Democrats. I remember them. They were a big part of those stories because they were Democrats who were against deficit spending. So people would argue that even though the Democrats had the House at the time, this particular contingent of Democrats would be upset at deficit spending. So I mean, the judges did that. I think is at least feasible. Although I dislike it because it might well be that none of the very old judges dies in the next 2 years. But I think that at least has an impact, right? Like there's a lot of 5-4 Supreme Court decisions that turn on whether or not the Democrats or Republicans have control. Obama is able to appoint, say Scalia dies, and Obama is able to appoint, one of the guy equally just appointed to the DC circuit to the Supreme Court. That would remarkably change the way, like, in those jurisprudence, a lot of those kind of close cases come out. So, something to consider. But broadly speaking, like when you're listening to midterms this year, that's the thing you got to keep in mind. If people say that, like the big problem with the way it was run yesterday, among others, and there's a lot of problems, was when they said that the Dems are going to win the midterms. It's like, what do you mean? Are they going to win the House and the Senate? Like, they're not going to win the House. We know that they're not. And what I mean, it's like, at that large sum of money, they're not going to win the House. But so if you say they're just going to win the midterms broadly, that doesn't really make much sense. And you just say, well, they're going to only win the Senate. It's sort of obvious that this is not like ground shaking in terms of the way it's going to impact foreign policy. People are going to want to make much more of the midterms than they should. I think it's just going to be a weak disad. And also, one of the things to keep in mind is that before elections, bills don't pass, man. People are worried about the perception of that. And so, like, if people try and read another disad in the fall, like, about this bill's really going to pass, you'd be like, the midterm elections are swamping this. All the Congress people are back home in their districts fighting it out. They're going to need, if you're going to read a politics disad in the fall that is not midterms, you're going to need to have a very good explanation of why this bill is going to pass in spite of the fact that everybody is focused on winning, everybody in Congress is focused on winning an election. So you'll need to be really careful and people shouldn't be running, the midterms itself will be a bad disad. So honestly, I think politics probably will be bad in the fall. I think it'll probably be mediocre in the spring too, because whenever you have, the Republicans and Democrats split in control of the Congress, it's really hard to make coherent stories about why bills will pass. And I would be careful about it. That's what I got. Questions? You guys are just tired tonight. So I'm reading my Kyle Kindle.
What's your take on focus arguments where it's not?
God, they're stupid.
Yeah.
Focus is like the thesis of a focus argument is somehow Obama is focusing on this thing right now, and that will lead to it passing. Your plan will magically distract Obama, as though he were a cat, and they're and that will lead to him not doing what we want. That's absolutely. I mean, these arguments are absolute, right? Like, most politics lectures tonight, if you actually listen to them, like, they treat politicians as though they were 5-year-olds, and some politicians do behave like that, but also that there's like an irrationality of the way that they treat politicians. And if you know anything about how hard it is to win a political campaign, politicians can be nothing if not ruthlessly irrational when it comes to their ability to win future elections in their base. So, like, doing things that are just silly doesn't make sense. Also, focus disads usually have a very inflated theory of the importance of one particular person. Obama has an administration. There are large numbers of people at his administration. He has meetings every day on dozens of issues, and it's not like, and there's plenty of stuff to talk about, so it's not that hard.
I guess I'm kind of caught up on. I feel like the judge's scenario is very probable as far as the impacts go, but I guess I have a hard time. What would the impact be? Like, well, sometimes there are rulings that are really close, and this could potentially mess up some ruling, but we don't know what.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's hard to say exactly what the ruling's going to be. I mean, I think a savvy debater would probably look at some of the cases that were going to be, heard at the Supreme Court this year and thought about like how those cases might be resolved in a world with a different judge. Because if a case is going to be heard by the court, it's going to be resolved. And if somebody dies, they got to fill the spot. So, yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. Alex might be.
I mean, the only big ticket case I can think of coming out this year is the Obama settlement.
Ooh, yes,
Yeah.
how big?
So, how big's coming up? And the thing is, though, nobody on the court is going to die next year. They're not going to find a replacement.
Yeah, it's not going to be that fast.
I mean, it takes probably 8 months to a year from start to finish to get the court justice on the court. And they're going to resolve how before that.
Yeah, probably.
I mean, back before they got rid of the filibuster, our judge's argument would usually not focus on what particular judges would do in particular cases, but we would just say judges won't get appointed, and lack of federal judges is bad for the economy, bad for business can't resolve their disputes, people can't sue police officers who beat them up, and then all that sort of stuff. But now the issue isn't federal judges aren't being appointed, it's what who they are.
Yeah, and that's the second. The funny thing is the 50 judge is a much wiser way to handle individual appointments, broadly speaking, for exactly that reason.
Yeah.
But it's a terrible politics.
Have you seen anything on Senate ratification of the treaty?
So I'm pretty sure you need 2/3 of the Senate to ratify a treaty. Remember that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're not going to get there.
Election's not going to impact that.